So my name is James Angus, and this is my show of new sculptures at Roslyn Oxley9 Gallery in Sydney. So all of these sculptures fall under a category of geometry that is called periodic minimal surfaces. And you know, it's sort of that it's a sort of family of shapes that I found, you know, scooching around sort of websites on the internet and started to explore, you know, in the work I've been making maybe over the past 5 years. And one thing that is interesting about them to me is that they can be connected infinitely and create continuous curvature. So there is a modularity that is really interesting, and the surfaces kind of flip inside out and fold. And that's sort of one of the properties that interests, you know, geometers who discover these forms over time. And I really became interested in trying to initially find a way to use the surfaces but make connection points so that they could be articulated in different colors. And in order to do that, I sort of had to invent this kind of bolting system, which I very much wanted to sort of to connect to the way that, you know, buildings are made and engineered. And I guess when you put all that together, what happens is that in a building, what would be considered the back of house stuff, or that is hidden, or that's not sort of really considered, gets turned inside out and presented sort of equally to the viewer. So you see construction and facade at the same time, entangled. So together it sort of works like a diagram in some ways. And although it's you know, materially the same object, it kind of speaks two different languages at the same time. And it's really interesting to me how we kind of listen to those languages and prioritize them, and whether one uses a kind of a hierarchy to understand them, or whether one can sort of see them as both being important in different ways. So the colors in the show were all hand mixed by me. And really what I do to kind of figure it out often is, these days, I've sort of been collecting images of things that I see walking around cities and streets and parks, and basically scraps or iterations of urban infrastructure, buildings, facades. And if I see a kind of color choices, because everything has to be kind of like, you know, given a surface treatment of some type, really, or a lot of it does. When I see sort of combinations that are really interesting to me, I kind of photograph them. And I'm always sort of looking for those sorts of, they're almost like ready-made paintings in some ways. And then I've sort of been trying to mix those colors in the studio and then apply them to these sculptures. So I kind of like have a kind of a library of different combinations kind of in my head, and sort of in sort of, you know, my materials, and I kind of apply those. So really I think of these sculptures as almost relics, sort of extracted from some other larger system or kind of constructed object. And I really wanted them to have a one-to-one scale or relationship. I guess I wanted them to have a one-to-one relationship with construction, so I use serious plate gauges and bolts that really would correspond with a much larger building. In some ways, they're sort of theatrically over-engineered, and they're sort of like an extraction from some other thing. And it was sort of important to me to signify that by having flame cut edges or oxyacetylene cut edges, as if they had really been cut from some other thing. So I would not really consider these actually ready-made objects, but they use bolts, and bolts exist in the world, and they have a one-to-one relationship with the world. And I guess you could say that, in some ways they're totally assisted ready-mades. They use existing fairly standard processes. They certainly use a type of geometry that I've appropriated from mathematics. But they're absolutely constructed objects, and I would place them more in the history of sort of the fabricated sculpture, really. I don't want to totally give away how they're constructed, but they are cast by a foundry just outside of Philadelphia. It's an industrial foundry, and they don't normally make art at all. They mostly make components for all sorts of applications, but from poured steel. So I've been working with them for about 15 years, and they make the components for me, make tooling, and send the bits and pieces to my studio in California, and I sort of put it all together and paint it from there. I'm pretty involved in the construction of my work, like very involved, really. And in this particular sort of series of works, each sculpture is really made from one part that is repeated through it and oriented in different, combinations, which lends itself perfectly to an industrial foundry because they're in the business of spitting out parts repeatedly en masse. I think when you look at a sculpture like this, it's kind of really tempting to think of it as theatre and to have like a sort of a proscenium stage on one side and a back of house on the other side. And actually what I really wanted to do with these sculptures was to take that relationship and kind of turn it inside out. So in fact, both parts of that construction are kind of meaningful in a way that's sort of apparent to someone who looks at it. Like for me, like the brilliance of sculpture is that you have to kind of walk around it to understand it properly. And that's really why I wanted to work with this sort of type of geometry, because it unfolds in all sorts of, to me, sort of crazy ways as you sort of navigate it in space, which is one of the kind of fundamental building blocks in the history of sculpture. And I just sort of think it's, so important now because it's really not an online activity at all, looking at sculpture. And when you put a bunch of these things together, you sort of have this sort of web of relationships that you have to navigate through as a person in real space, in real time. And you have to get to a gallery and look at the thing and then leave the gallery. And that whole experience to me is like sort of really important. And I just want this work to be a kind of like a conduit for that sort of activity and a reminder how sort of important it is to kind of be in the world. So I think like the kind of path to this work sort of came out of being interested in geometry as a way to kind of generate forms, and also being interested in the way that objects are made. To me, it's really important how something is made, and I sort of think that there's kind of like a meaning and a kind of politics of labor in particular attached to that. So, I've sort of like worked my way through different sort of existing ways of like generating forms in space. And in the last show, I used periodic minimal surfaces to make a surface. And I guess really I wanted to be able, in this show, to take those surfaces, but apply a kind of polychromatic or multichromatic system of coloring to it, because that's kind of how the world is. The world is not monochromatic at all, and it's sort of all of those sort of languages of color and contrast and so on that sort of make cities interesting to look at. So for me, the problem then became figuring out a system of construction that could articulate those color changes, but that was consistent with the geometry I was using, and made sense from a fabrication point of view. And that required, you know, a system of bolting in the same way that, in a similar way, I guess, to the way that a building is constructed, for example. So, something that really interests me about sculpture and other people's sculpture is the way that they're made. And, you know, typically with a modern sculpture, you look at the kind of welds and bolts and things, but they're really just a means to an end. And I kind of wanted to make a sculpture using bolts, where the bolts actually became a really important way of understanding the way it was made. And sort of what that means at the same time is that it also takes the objects, you know, out of the realm of sculpture and sort of puts them back in the way that the rest of the world is constructed at times. So I wanted to figure out a way to use nuts and bolts to assemble these sculptures in a really explicit sort of way, and not just have them as, you know, a means of construction, but as, you know, like an index of labor, really. And, you know, eventually, like, I'd like to figure out a way where I can make a sculpture that is all bolt and no sculpture. Like, that is sort of the direction I kind of wanted to kind of send these sculptures in. I think it's really important to give artworks titles, and my titles have changed a lot, I guess. Recently, I used to use, you know, fairly prosaic titles for my work, and I've sort of shifted that recently. In some ways, with sculpture like this, the titles are irrelevant, but then it's also an opportunity to play with language. And so for a lot of this work, I've been kind of lifting phrases or words or sometimes names from mostly like music, the history of music, songs. It doesn't have to be music that I like particularly, but it's just interesting to me how, you know, words can shift between media. And so it's just kind of like a prompt, and I can kind of connect that to some of the formal properties of the sculptures. And then it just sort of, I guess it kind of inserts them back in popular culture a little, and then they can have other lives, you know, outside of all of their formal properties. And that's like totally fun to play with. So in this show, there are three types of periodic minimal surfaces, I guess, or categories. Three kind of codes that I'm sort of used to put them all together. And they repeat through a number of different sculptures. But this sculpture is really the only one of that particular type. And so I decided to call it Misfit, which is sort of a, you know, borrowed from a band called the Misfits. But that's sort of the way I sort of am using the titling. It's about sort of just casting a net across popular culture and pulling out words, and then applying them to the, you know, like the formal properties of the thing itself, or the relationships between the sculptures and so on. You know, and ultimately Misfit and Mother are very different sculptures, you know, and so they should be. So when I was sort of figuring out the colors for the sculptures, or the color combinations, and mixing them, I started to narrow it down to, I guess, within my own kind of like universe, some standard colors for this show, and then I would you know, repeat them through some of the sculptures. So a brown in this sculpture, you know, as a result, looks very different to the same brown in a different sculpture. And then sometimes within the sculptures themselves, what I decided to do was make very slight shifts in the colors that are kind of like confused by the form of the work itself. So from one angle, they may look monochromatic, but from others, you can sort of see the split. Sometimes a color that looks the same as a color to another sculpture is actually a different color, and vice versa. And that was all sort of part of the game, you know, with the show. And once again, is why, you know, these sculptures are like really hard to photograph, which to me is like a great sculpture because it's something that you have to see in real life. And all of those kind of formal games really unfold best when you're actually wandering around the sculpture itself in real space and real time.